Incremental readings. Today we have something special. We have discussion about dyslexia with two people, two guests. One is no other than Piotr Wozniak himself, the creator of Special Petition, SuperMemo, and Incremental Reading. Hello, Incremental Readings.
Hello, hello, hello.
Yeah, your first appearance ever. Not with your face, but at least with your voice.
Yes.
Nice, fascinating. And for the other side, we have Zander from the US, who perhaps considers himself no one special, but for us he is, because he never went to the school system. Hello, incremental
Hello.
readings.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, welcome. So I will be just the host. I will just moderate in case it's needed. So I hope my job is minimal. So let me start, Piotr. What's your definition of dyslexia?
Dyslexia
Yep.
is difficulty in acquiring the skill of reading. And my main thesis for today is school causes dyslexia. So I want Xander to speak about this because he never went to school. So perhaps he will see the obstacles in obstacles on the way to reading in a schooling environment when nobody's pushing you, nobody's instructing you. So I hope he abolishes my argument.
Okay.
All right, so can you just kind of lay out, just so we can get a sense of where you are? Why do you think that, and what are the core tenets of your argument?
Okay, but I will add one spicy detail yet. I'm writing an article now called Dyslexia Conspiracy, just because I was accused by many teachers of being some kind of conspiracy theorist. I say the school caused dyslexia. This sounds so mad, so out of whack, that they call me a conspiracy theorist. So I write an article, Dyslexia Conspiracy. And 2 days ago, I wrote to a scientist who wrote a fantastic article about dyslexia, which I use for my argument. I wrote to him, and he replied, "You totally don't understand dyslexia. You totally didn't understand my article." Okay, so that's a little intro to spice up the appetizing dish.
All right.
Whatever
So,
science of this of reading tells you, I would like to simplify it. To learn to read, you just need to be able to see letters. You need to be able to think about the world, understand the world more or less, and most of us do. And you need to be able to connect those two. Most brains are wired okay. By some estimate, for sure, 99% of the brains are wired okay for the purpose of reading. So if we can see letters and we can connect those parts of the brain when the recognition happens, we should be able to learn to read and forget about the whole phonological pronunciation or orthographical mapping stuff. This is not necessary. Zander, I know that you're a programmer, so I imagine I will try to convince you with a computational model of learning to read. You have just
okay.
two sets of neural networks. One neural network is responsible for pattern recognitions of what you see,
Hmm.
and the other network, let's call it the brain, understands the world. So now you need to connect those two networks and let the pattern recognition network inform the brain what's on the input. The rest is up to the brain. Once you have those two connected, the computer will work. What do you say?
Mm. I mean, that makes sense, but I just want to, before we go too deep onto that or some kind of analogy, I just want to clarify. You mentioned basically reading itself and basically ignore all the phonological deficits that are present in
Mhm.
dyslexia. But to me, that doesn't make much sense because even adults who have, let's say, very mild dyslexia, often they'll mispronounce words hundreds of times, even after being corrected continuously about the
Mhm.
pronunciation. They can't pronounce it right. They're not
Mhm.
hearing it right. Something's not mapping on correctly. They still can't pronounce it correctly. So to me, to say it's a purely reading condition, that's not exactly clear to me. Just as a point of clarity there before before we go too deep on that. And also, I think it's kind of confusing, at least it's confusing to me, to say 99% of brains are wired okay for reading. I'm not sure in what sense you mean that. Reading what and at what level, and because dyslexics can read, they can learn to read, but they just have reading deficits. So I just want to figure out exactly what point you're making there and see if I can get on the same page.
Okay, so I will start from the second point. In 2004, Velutino wrote a nice paper in which he analyzed different aspects of dyslexia. He concluded that less than 1% of cases of dyslexia has organic causes, which means there are some specific problems with the brain that can be somehow identified or perhaps cannot be excluded. So this 1% will be reserved for organic causes in the brain. 99% of cases of dyslexia somehow hides in the areas beyond the organic changes in the brain. From this, you may conclude it's an environmental component of our life. As for phonological, orthographic mapping, etc., consider just one thing. A dyslexic can see the word temperature and he can say fever. In other words, he may be totally unable to recognize letters, he may be unable to pronounce the word, but he makes the right semantic connection between the word fever and the word temperature and the concept of temperature or fever. Then, when asked what is written on the paper, he can say fever. Does it convince you?
Not exactly, because even that ability to understand semantically what it is, the persistent presence rather, of that inability to correctly pronounce the word or a given set of words or spell with any fluidity or read at a rapid rate, these kinds of things. The persistence of these things signals to me, and I think there's plenty of supporting evidence on this, although I'm not an expert by any definition on dyslexia or any learning disability, but to me it signals that there's some deeper set of things or deeper disability, deeper neurobiological effect that's producing all these symptoms. And to say that it's only about reading would seem to me kind of odd, given that there are other manifestations of the, what do you call it, ailment.
I think to convince you, I will need to present the model of dyslexia and others called educational dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as you're both familiar with SuperMemo, you very quickly come to understand the basic mechanics, which may elude a run-of-the-mill scientist who never had anything to do with spaced repetition or understanding the arcane aspects of spaced repetition. Perhaps I will present one simple experiment. I especially made some notes for you, and I wonder if this will sound convincing to you. And this will be the introduction to the mechanics of dyslexia. If you understand the mechanics, then perhaps it'd be much easier for you to accept the fact that reading requires very simple brain circuits, and whatever comes out all around the problem with reading, what you're mentioning in reference to, say, pronunciation, all those extra things can be explained by mechanisms similar to the mechanism of dyslexia itself. So my question will be this. Imagine you have a 2-year-old child, and the child learns 4 letters, M-A-S-H, MASH. Over the next 10 years, using SuperMemo, the kid proves he retains in his memory the ability to recognize the letter M-A-S-H and to pronounce it M-A-S-H. In other words, the kid can learn those letters at the age of 2, and we can prove that almost certainly those letters stayed in memory, perhaps with a little bit of help from spaced repetition and contact with print, for the next 10 years. How would you see this case? Would this kid be for you special, like smart because he can read the tool, or just normal, How do you see that?
I would personally just see that as normal.
Normal, okay. Now consider the same kid can take the letter Y at the same age, and over the next 6 years, up to the age of 8, in 173 repetitions in SuperMemo, he failed 32 times to remember that Y is Y. Just in case you think Y is unusual in terms of its name, the same kid had problems with the letter U in a similar time span, similar number of memory lapses. So in SuperMemo, you can show that this kid has not been able to remember the correct naming of the letter Y at the age of 8. How would you see that kid? As okay, or perhaps dyslexic, or with a potential for dyslexia? What would you say?
If it's restricted to the name of the letter, I would assume that's normal. Also, I've seen a similar thing in kids, and I even have some vague recollection of some things in my own brain when I was very young that wouldn't stick like that. So I would think that's just on the spectrum of normal, and there's some things that are, for whatever reason, very hard to remember. So if it's restricted, I guess, to the name of the letter, I would still think that's normal.
Okay, so now take those two letters, U and Y, and you ask, which is U, which is Y, and you provide the pronunciation, and the kid cannot differentiate between those two letters. Is it now tougher?
Tougher in the sense, would I think of that as some form of dyslexia or a
Yeah,
predilection
but
for
coming closer
a reading
to
difficulty?
say you're a
Right.
parent and you see this, your kid is 8 years old and cannot differentiate between U and Y, even
Yeah,
if you
if
try.
that right. I would think that that's a signal of some kind of deficit, or at
Co-
least not a special ability in that area. Yeah.
yeah, collectively 300 repetitions, trying
Right.
to disentangle those two letters. So you're both experts in SuperMemo. At least Palace, I think, is an expert in Super. Gulen
Yeah.
is an expert in SuperMemo. Would you have some explanation? How is that possible that the letter A comes so easily and letter U is so intractable, letter Y is so intractable? What would be your explanation for that?
Some kind of interference, I would guess.
Interference. That's a fantastic thing. Yeah, you recall leeches from SuperMemo, and perhaps you recall the term which I use to explain the phenomenon of leeches as toxic memory.
Right.
Toxic memory is a wrong association between a piece of data which we want to memorize. So, for example, you see the letter U and you expect a teacher to be extremely angry with you. In other words, your brain may be perfectly capable of recognizing letters, making link between a letter and its pronunciation, but somehow this healthy brain who can tackle A can tackle U just because that U makes a toxic memory association with something associated with coercion, school, bad things. In other words, in an extreme case, we can scare a kid to divert his brain from the task of reading to any kind of any form of anxiety, worry, or any other factor that could cause memory interference, down to the anxiety-free interference of memory, just because you see you and you know, I always mix it up with Y, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you. I don't know which is left, which is right. I don't know how much is 6 times 6 because I always confuse it with 7 times 8. I don't know the months or the seasons. That's all classic cases of toxic memory. So that would be a proof, a simple proof for a thought experiment, which tells you that all you need is a letter, is a pattern. You should be able to see that there is a circle or there is a line, and you should be able to think about this. Make an association between a letter and a concept.
Mm.
Then you can make association with combination of letters, words, sentences, and that's the basis of reading. So in other words, we can have a perfect brain and it can show signs of dyslexia as a result of incorrect instruction. What would be the correct way to remedy the problem here? Very simple. Step away. Just don't bother the kid with those letters. Go away, let him learn all by himself. Okay, are we closer to convincing Zander?
I agree in that case. Well, let me just say in general, I agree that there are obviously many circumstances where coerciveness, forcing kids to learn things, can actually reduce their learning
Mhm,
because of these responses you're talking about, anxiety, fear, whatever else,
mhm.
and or just forcing them to learn asemantic information, incoherent information, which makes it harder to remember in the first place. So
Yeah.
I would never disagree with that. I agree with that totally. Where I would disagree is, first of all, I don't know whether the tendency to mix up those letters at age 8 is eh, even predictive of dyslexia per se. It might be predictive of some like mild difficulty with reading, but maybe that's along the normal spectrum and the actual diagnosis for dyslexia is something totally different. And like I say, it seems plausible to me that even a kid who would mix that up would not have these other sets of symptoms, or these other symptoms rather, that are present in dyslexia. You know,
Okay.
difficulty with pronunciation of words that they've heard many times, or
Yeah.
those kinds of things. So that would be one thing. And again, like I say, in that case, yes, I agree with you that reducing the coercion is going to help, probably, if it really is caused by that kind of toxic memory. But again, I just don't know that it's the case that the presence of a toxic memory with letters is the same thing as dyslexia.
Okay, so my main point here is this. I can show easily that you can develop a toxic memory in the area of reading. You have all
Mm.
necessary circuits to connect pattern recognition with the conceptual world, which lives in the cortex of the brain. This simple experiment shows that while letter A can travel the right pathway through a wrong education approach based on coercion, or perhaps other factors which generate anxiety, we
Mm.
can produce toxic memory. What I want to now add to expand to this reasoning is that the same kind of toxic memory can be built for letters, can be built for sounds, can be built for connections, can be built for concepts, can be built for the color of the classroom where you learn. So the entire spectrum of difficulty with reading may come from generating toxic memories in condition of schooling, coercion, unpleasant learning, even therapy. Because I don't hear much about kids enjoying therapy against dyslexia. So therapy,
Mm.
however nice it is dressed, it's usually coercive. Someone tells the kid, you need to do it, because if you don't do it, you don't learn. And if you don't learn, there are other consequences. So there is a
So you
ladder.
mean by therapy, you mean like remedial classes for reading?
Exactly.
Okay.
So what would be your next question or next point of doubt?
Yeah, wait,
I
wait.
think I.
Before we go to the next point, I have some questions, if you don't mind.
Mhm.
Okay. So you said you recollect some data. So he was unable to recall or how to pronounce the word that contains the Y or U in that moment.
Mhm.
I think you said, I don't know how many out of 300. But those are just those are scenarios. How you do stretch that, hey, this is because the reasoning is because toxic memories. In order to know that, you should have an MRI or something that scans the brain at that moment to verify
Mhm.
that has a negative emotional response when he sees that word.
Mm, not necessarily. The reason is this. If you define toxic memory
Hmm?
as the inability to remember something despite repeated exposure, you can call it toxic memory. And if you define toxic memory like this, you can describe the whole dyslexia in terms of toxic memory. So all behaviors which are off the norm can be described as can be described in terms of toxic memory. And when I say not necessarily associated with stress, as Zander said at the very beginning, interference
Yeah.
lies at the bottom of problems with learning. In other words, wrong context will generate interference. Interference will generate toxic memory. If this toxic memory becomes, actually, I introduce a more complex terminology to include anxiety in toxic memory, but let's skip that. Let's keep it simple. When the anxiety comes in, which usually happens in the context of coercion or school, then the whole dyslexia is not only a bunch of toxic memories and associations, but it's also associated with anxiety, then avoidance, and
Exactly.
all problems associated with coercion, which as a boss of pleasurable learning, I know you're perfectly aware of.
Yeah, so I think that's more or less the case of the chicken or the egg, what comes first. Because if I have difficulty reading those letters, and the therapy consists on more iterations, more repetitions on what's harder, this will increase my anxiety and will yield toxic memories.
Mhm.
So this will
But I wouldn't
be,
call it.
and this will be resulting theoretically in dyslexia. So I would, if that was my case, I was not dyslexic to begin with. Just the therapy to solve the dyslexia exacerbated my deficiency.
So speak about your own case.
No, no, I'm using um, the first person
He's
for
speaking
for modesty.
hypothetically.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay. I wouldn't agree this is a chicken and egg because actually you can identify the cause as the redirection of the natural selection of knowledge by the brain through coercive means or any external force. Nothing wrong will happen to the brain, a healthy brain, if there is no coercion factor, if there is no deprivation of freedom, if there is no redirection. So I wouldn't call it chicken and egg.
Okay.
Okay, can I come at it from a totally different direction just
Yeah.
to
Yes,
see
please.
if we can land on the same page? So, oh, what were you gonna say, Palace?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, please. What I said.
Yeah, I was curious. So, would you agree that cognitive abilities exist on a spectrum, and some kids are just natively gifted at certain things? They're just very much better than average.
No, no. Unless the spectrum is very narrow. I'll tell you an interesting extension of this, my exchange with this scientist who told me that I don't understand dyslexia at all. I was motivated to look at his lecture about dyslexia because actually it turns out that our point of disagreement is that he believes in therapy. So, as far as I can see, I agree with this guy 100% and everywhere, apart from the fact that he believes kids will not learn naturally. He doesn't believe in natural ability to learn because of some kind of missing evolutionary adaptation. So I watched his lecture and he presented some kind of model of cognitive spectrum the way you describe it, which inspired me to speak about something which is similar to critical path analysis. This is a computer science terminology. If you let me, I'll try to explain it in simple words. I'm not sure I'll manage, but I will try. If you see the brain as a concept network, in other words, it's a neural network where neurons group into concepts so that a concept might represent uh, Alice or Xander or me. Those concepts live in the brain. The entire brain in development is building all those concepts. It becomes a healthy concept network. I call it the conceptualization process. In all cognitive development, this process is very uneven. Some concepts crystallize faster, some crystallize later, and it all depends on the exposure to the environment. So your trajectory will determine the crystallization of concepts in your brain. And then, if each single concept has some inherent properties that are different from kid to kid, and there is this little spectrum, say some neurons grow their dendrites faster, this little spectrum will concern individual concepts, while the entire conceptualization process is, like the name says, multiple concepts connected in the network. So if you
Hmm.
want to measure progress along a specific axis, you may see fantastic performance, and in another axis, you will see nothing. So the same kid measured in different contexts, like the famous parable of climbing a tree
Mm-hmm.
by a fish. If
Right.
you compare a giraffe and a fish, which one is inherently better at sports? The one who climbs the tree or the one who swims? The same thing is with cognition. And in case of reading, kids will learn at the age of 2 on their own, or at the age of 15 on their own. Actually, I know a case of a guy who learned probably at the age of 30 after attending a democratic school. That's a very odd case. And what's the difference between all those kids? I would compare it to walking in the woods. Everybody's going in his own direction. And the guy who finds the mushroom first is considered the smartest. So this is how I see the spectrum. If you measure the spectrum of the, say, reading speed or acquisition of knowledge, it all boils down to different speeds of different concepts in the critical path analysis of concept network. So all kids will develop differently. We just should just let them be. Stop measuring. Let them develop where they feel their adaptation leads them. Let them find their own niche. So one will learn at
I agree with that. I agree with that summation there at the end. But the
excellent.
idea that there aren't inherent differences in people, to me, is just, first of all, it's totally unsupported by any evidence I've seen, and also just my intuition.
Mhm.
I feel that you can tell, even with very, very young kids, that they are just smarter. Or, some are less smart than other kids. You can tell that right away, oftentimes, even when a kid is 2. And this is not in a particular way. It's not something to do with a specific piece of knowledge. It's
Mhm.
that their ability to, you could say, compute some new thing, or generalize some new concept, or abstract some piece of information, or predict some rule given a small sample set. These things are improved in some people. They're just, some people are just smarter. And if we take the extreme case of someone like Terrence Tao, I mean, here's a guy who, when he was a little kid, he was able to do extremely advanced mathematics, and that persisted all through his life, where he was just ahead of everyone else. It's hard for me to believe that a guy like that, or a guy like Paul Erdős or Ramanujan, or pick your favorite genius, was just because of some environmental difference rather than some genetic or whatever else, something pre-birth, something just you were gifted with that. It's hard for me to believe there's none of that in the recipe there. And the reason why I'm making this point is, if we can establish and agree that there is a spectrum and some people are just born better, then surely some people are born worse. And we can look at almost everything: intelligence, height, whatever else, hair color, cancer rates, Alzheimer's disease. All these things have a strongly genetic component. So, we have tons of twin studies, for instance, where twins even grow up in totally different environments, and they end up quite similar in many ways. So we have quite strong, I would say, quite robust data in many domains: personality, psychological disorders, issues like cancer, Alzheimer's disease. Certainly, Alzheimer's obviously is that one that people have been talking about recently. All these have a strongly genetic component, so we would have to then make an exception for dyslexia and say all these other things have a strongly genetic component and very obviously are linked and will likely occur in this set of people, even if they grow up in different environments, and then say dyslexia does not have that. That just seems odd to me. And also, we're still left with this problem one layer below, or at least one layer below, we could say, where, yes, even if it's exacerbated by the environment or revealed by the environment, if you prefer that, some people exist in the same learning environment and don't develop any reading difficulties. So, what explains that? At the end, you're just going to have to say some people are more robust for whatever reason, one reason or another. Or you can say their environment at home protects them in some way or another. But in some way, you're describing some pre existing difference between individuals that inoculates them against this very particular kind of toxic memory formation that results in what you're claiming as dyslexia. So I just find that's an awful lot of leaps to take for me, instead of just saying some people are born with some kind of deficit and they struggle to read in a way that most people do not. And, let's target some therapies for them. That's not to say that coercive instruction does not worsen or create a lot of learning difficulties for people. I'm not claiming that 100% of dyslexia cases are genetic or inherited or otherwise totally unrelated to their learning environment. All I'm saying is it seems extremely unlikely to me that there's not a neurobiological basis of this that is highly heritable. And even if it weren't heritable, I would just think, like I said, it's a congenital condition or something that has nothing to do with coercive instruction.
Let's stay in the area of cognitive science. So let's not speak about, let's say, cancer or height. Let's focus on what you say about Terence Tao. When you give him as an example, you use measurement of a concept network along a specific axis. I guess this might be your favorite axis. When you see a good mathematician, you see high intelligence. If you measure in a different axis, say some kind of talent for painting, you might discover that Terence is terrible and someone else is much better. If you speak about the spectrum and all kids are born different, I beg to disagree, and I propose a mental experiment. Imagine that my claim is that for good intellectual development, you need just two things: a brain with a sizable brain cortex for storing data, and curiosity. Kids differ in the size of their brain, but the bottleneck in learning and development in being intellectual is not the size of the brain, but how we fill it up. We have plenty of brain, much more brain than we actually need. So let's dispense with that one argument. Healthy brain, most of kids get when they get born. That's at least 99%, let's say.
I agree with you, healthy, but in the same way, we
Oh,
could say most kids are born with a healthy body, but that doesn't mean that most kids are going to be Usain Bolt. Some people
okay.
just are gifted in some way, and some people are the reverse, and they are slower. If we take the running example, slower than average. And again, I know
Now,
you want to stay in the cognitive realm, so but I'll just finish this point really quickly. I'm not trying to separate that, but again, if we're just reasoning from first principles, even if you don't want to take evidence of cognitive differences from birth, even if you don't want that, we can all see physical differences. And so, why would it be that the brain, which is part of the biological system, is somehow exempted from these genetic differences? That would be extremely surprising to me. It wouldn't really make much sense.
they don't call me crackpot for nothing. So I absolutely agree. Look, I need to finish my story because I said we need a brain and curiosity. So I didn't manage to finish that. But I'll give you a
Oh, sorry about that.
counterexample. I will give you a counterexample. Everybody's every healthy pupil is round. So that's a constant in humans. Pupils or irises are round. Similarly, brains are great at learning. And the bottleneck of learning is how we fill up the brain. And here we come to the second factor, the curiosity. I love kids. So when I see a pram passing by, I always peek in. I rarely see a kid who is born incurious. The curiosity actually develops still in the placenta. So if mom drinks a lot of alcohol, or exaggerates with coffee, or got the early delivery, all those things will affect the actual bottleneck, which is the curiosity, and all the machinery responsible for detecting the value of knowledge and encoding knowledge in memory. In other words, brains, if you measure the various parameters of the conductivity, how they grow, healthy brains do not differ that much. And healthy kids are born curious. Those two factors are essential for development. All the rest, all the differentiation, those Terence Taos and Singers, all those come from environmental differentiations. So if you take twins, identical twins, and put them in a single environment, the interaction between them and minor instability in their behavioral system may result in one becoming a dominant twin and one being a weaker twin who'll clean the floor. So identical twin will develop in total different personalities in the exactly same environment. People have the tendency to spread widely, and what I would like to see is a world where we remove those crazy obstacles associated with deprivation of freedom. If there is a major or minor differentiation in the spectrum of the properties of individual concepts in the brain or individual neurons, that's really a secondary thing because the optimum is still freedom. School causes dyslexia because school is coercive. And if kids learn to read later because of inherent properties of the brain, really, I don't see a problem with that. Lots of kids learn to read at 12 or 13 in unschooling conditions. Probably you have lots of friends, so perhaps you can give me some interesting anecdotes.
Oh yeah, certainly. And again, I don't agree with that, or I don't disagree with that last point. If a kid learns to read later, either because of some natural difficulty or because they just didn't want to learn to read earlier, then I think that's fine. If somebody eventually learns to read and they're able to do what they want to do and succeed in the ways that they care about in life, I think that's totally fine. But I think it's a separate point from the cause of what we're talking about here, dyslexia. Again, I've even seen neuroimaging studies demonstrating actual brain differences in children who with a family history of dyslexia before they've even started learning to read. And so
Mhm.
again, all this evidence, along with just basic first principles reasoning of everything has, basically everything has a strongly genetic component. Sometimes it's weaker, but very many things have a very strong genetic component, including diseases, including personality traits, including basically everything. And it would not make sense to me if somehow this condition of dyslexia, this cluster of symptoms that gets labeled as dyslexia, had nothing whatever to do with genetics and it was purely caused by a classroom environment. If you want to say that coercive learning environments worsen learning deficits or can worsen them, certainly I would agree with that. I think that's extremely plausible. It makes sense from basically every direction to me. But to say that it has nothing to do with it and it's purely an environmental thing, it just doesn't make sense to me, especially given that many people with the same environment do not go on to develop it. So, of course, a priori, we're saying that people are different, or we have to acknowledge that if we're just looking at reality, because when multiple people go into an environment and they don't end up with the same thing, then some people are more resistant to it. In the same way that some people can be exposed to smoking cigarettes and then they don't go on to get cancer or emphysema or whatever. To me, it's the same kind of thing. People are just different.
What scientists do in neuroimaging is they just see the difference between a reading brain and not reading brain. From all that, you can derive all the research and you can explain all the research. There's never been a proven causality of brain differences between dyslexics and reading people, apart from proving that there is a correlation between function and the scans and the ability to read. But guys, I think there is one thing yet to missing in our conversation. Perhaps we should tell parents, teachers what they should do. I would say computer games are a fantastic way to learn to read, and this could proceed much slower than learning at school, and the kid might learn later. But that's not a worry because at the same time, develop a healthy, intelligent, happy individual who is never bothered by reading at school. And dyslexia will keep increasing due to TikToks and YouTubes and other factors. So I think we need to spread this message. Parents, please let them play.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Probably you're more like if you are, let's say that somebody out there accepts that dyslexia does have a genetic component, right? And this person is going to have difficulty learning. You're more likely to learn to read in a situation where it's driven by your own need or interest. So you want to be able to, read the menus on a game, or you want to learn how to code, so you have to learn how to read documentation or whatever else. These days, maybe you want to use ChatGPT to make a video game or do something cool. You have to be able to read the outputs and deal with that and interact with computers and message your friends on whatever. So it's those kinds of things. I would
Well,
say if somebody is having difficulties, they're more likely to learn in that context. That makes intuitive sense to me. Although it's obviously a hard piece of advice to implement if you're concerned that your kid
Exactly.
is
So
not going to learn
maybe
English.
I should have touched this genetic component to ease the worries. If it runs in families, mom is dyslexic and kid is playing games, she would naturally be worried. So let's
Hmm.
emphasize everything cognitive is genetic. Where we disagree with mainstream science is that the spectrum of performance is microscopic. Every gene has a microscopic impact on this spectrum you spoke about and this distribution of quality at the level of neurons and concepts. So all those genes have microscopic effects. These are nuances, these are breezes. That every healthy kid who is not deprived of his curiosity and got goals which are blocked by the inability to read, every healthy kid with all those tools will absolutely learn to read. And that's a theoretical model. That's a spotless theoretical model. Let nobody worry. And of course, read all other sources. Most of them say otherwise. Genetic, it's a hereditary neurodevelopmental disorder everywhere. Wikipedia,
Mm.
ChatGPT, everybody will tell you that.
Well, I certainly can agree with you that most people, most kids especially, are very far away from their potential, and in all likelihood, forcing them to do things they don't want to do is not going to get them closer to it.
Excellent. Wallace, I think we have an optimistic summary.
Okay.
Most people have great potential. Let's use it by making learning pleasurable.
Yeah, even though
Boom.
I had one question,
Okay.
is there any difference in the language? Because most of the languages, at least in the European languages, they're like phonological, right? So we use letters, and those letters kind of represents one sound or two or a few. But what about like Chinese, that they don't represent any sound at all? It's just by meaning. Do they
This
have
is this
dyslexia
is
as well when reading?
yes. This is a non-issue from the point of view of the model I presented. As long as they can see the characters, as long as they can reason about them, meaning there is a connection between the ability to recognize patterns and think about them, they can learn. They can learn reading. Very interesting case happened in Japan, which was described in literature in 1999. A bilingual boy in with dyslexia in English only. That kid lived in a very ambitious and literate English environment in Japan. So his parents were like professors, I don't remember exactly, smart people who possibly exerted a little bit of pressure on a kid. Please learn English. English is important, reading is important, literacy is important. The kid developed dyslexia. And the big shock came when he went to school in Japan and he learned Japanese without problems. Katakana, hiragana, kanji, whatever. So you can see perfect case where dyslexia diagnosed in a healthy brain is shown to be a phantom just because the kid learned another language without any effort. What is said is that scientists consider that attributed that to orthographic depth. In other words, we know that Japanese has different properties than English. And they try to look at those differences and say, oh, I'll get dyslexia for that and not for that. So that was a set, but this first case, very inspirational. And Zander, Danny Greenberg says in his Sudbury Valley School, democratic school, where the kids have total freedom, in a 50 or 60-year history, they had not a single case of dyslexia. Kids who came from outside with dyslexia improved. So that's another point of high inspiration for people to think about dyslexia as a neurodevelopmental hereditary disorder, which it is not. Freedom is the solution, and pleasurable learning.
And my other question before, while you were speaking, is that perhaps there's a genetic condition, not necessarily for the difficulty of reading, but the response to coercion. That some people respond better to the coercion.
Yes, yes. So there are genes which affect personality, which have very nuanced effect. So, for example, the sensitivity. Some people are more sensitive to pain, others are less sensitive. Some people are more resistant to stress, others are less resistant. Those differences can be microscopic, but from the very young age, they can build up and build up. So, say a kid is born with a slightly higher sensitivity, and say mom is not nice, and he cries, and mom gets unhappy. They enter into a feedback loop where it amplifies the unhappiness in the kid and his sensitivity. So instead of growing a happy intellectual, we have a kid who looks oppressed and unhappy in life. So there are minor genetic differences, there are genes, but those are really flea farts in the hurricane. The real differentiator is the environment.
Yes,
Mm.
the big differentiator is the environment, but there's a precondition in the genes still, like
Yeah,
Zander
remember
says.
those things are polygenic and pleiotropic, which basically means every gene has lots of effects. So you may have problems with the muscle in the eye, and this will affect your dyslexia. This jungle of influences between genes and phenotypes is so complex that you can tweak a little bit here and a little bit of there, and you have a totally different outcome in identical environments. But it's worth to remember what Turkheimer said, that in identical environments, the heritability is blown up. So, in other words, you can manipulate heritability as computed by the modern scientific methods by changing environments. And school is an example of a homogenizing environment. If kids were separated at school, they were all in the same class, in the same chair, getting the same program, they'll be in identical environments. And there, the heritability would really blow up because the one with those weaker, nuanced genes might really drift in a very different direction than the one who is more less or more sensitive.